The prisoners always watched Staff Sergeant Jake Thornton differently. Not with the usual hatred they reserved for guards, not with the mocking disrespect they showed the rookies. Something else entirely. When Thornton walked Block 7, conversations stopped mid-sentence. The toughest inmates, men who'd killed with their bare hands, suddenly found their cell floors fascinating. Just another screw, they'd whisper to themselves, but every instinct screamed otherwise. That night, when 15 maximum security prisoners broke containment and the riot leader took one look at Thornton's face before dropping his weapon and backing against the wall, everyone finally understood. This quiet man was something they'd never encountered before. United States Disciplinary Barracks, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The most secure military correctional facility in America. Built to house the worst military criminals. Traitors who sold state secrets, soldiers who murdered civilians, officers who betrayed their units. This wasn't some county jail. This was where careers ended and legends died in concrete boxes. Staff Sergeant Jake Thornton had worked Block 7 for 16 years. 16 years of 5:45 a.m. arrivals, 6:15 p.m. departures. Never a minute late. Never calling in sick. At 43 years old, he'd become invisible furniture to most staff. Just another lifer counting days until retirement. But the inmates in Block 7, they saw something different. Something that made hardened killers sleep better at night, somehow knowing he was there. Block 7 contained 52 cells, each housing the absolute worst the military justice system had to offer. Captain Rex Morrison, life sentence for selling troop movements to insurgents that resulted in 12 American deaths. Sergeant First Class David Kellner, death row for executing captured civilians during a raid gone wrong. Staff Sergeant Luis Vega, 40 years for running guns to cartels while stationed at the Mexican border. These weren't soldiers who'd made mistakes. These were predators who'd worn American uniforms. But here's what made Jake Thornton different from every other guard in the facility. In 16 years, he'd never written a single disciplinary report, never called for backup, never used his baton, never deployed pepper spray, never requested segregation for any prisoner under his watch. His block ran smoother than administrative offices, quieter than Sunday chapel services. Other guards couldn't figure it out. "How the hell does he do it?" Sergeant Patricia Wells asked during a staff meeting. "I've got inmates throwing shit at me daily, and Thornton's got serial killers saying please and thank you." "Maybe he's dirty," suggested Corporal Danny Kim. "Maybe he's got some kind of deal going with them." But Staff Sergeant Lisa Chen, who'd worked every block in the facility, shook her head slowly. "It's not that. Watch him sometime. Really watch. The way he moves, the way he positions himself, how he speaks to them. It's like he's speaking their language, but not in a bad way. Like he understands something about them that we don't." What none of them knew was that Jake Thornton's personnel file contained more black ink than actual information. Previous assignments, redacted. Combat deployments, classified. Specialized training, need-to-know basis only. Military awards and commendations, above your clearance level. 16 years of working alongside this man, and nobody knew who he really was. But let me tell you what really made the prisoners respect Jake Thornton. It wasn't fear exactly, though there was an element of that. It was recognition. These men, criminals though they were, had all been soldiers once. They'd all seen combat, faced death, made impossible decisions under impossible pressure. And when they looked at Thornton, some deep, instinctual part of them recognized a predator far more dangerous than they'd ever been. Captain Morrison put it best during one of his rare conversations with other inmates. You know what scares me about Thornton? It's not what he does. It's what he doesn't do. Man's got more self-control than a Buddhist monk, but you can see it in his eyes sometimes. He's choosing not to hurt us. Every single day he's making that choice. And that tells me he could hurt us real bad if he wanted to. Sergeant Kellner nodded thoughtfully. Been in combat with men like that. Operators who went so far downrange they came back different. Quiet guys who'd seen things, done things, that changed them permanently. They don't brag about it, don't talk about it, but you can feel it radiating off them like heat from a fire. Question is, Morrison continued, what's a guy like that doing babysitting us? Someone with his background should be running special operations, not changing bed sheets in military prison. But here's what they didn't know. October 23rd, 2024, Tuesday evening, 9:30 p.m. Jake was finishing his shift paperwork when the first anomaly occurred. Cell doors in Block 7 operated on a centralized electronic system controlled from the main security station. Each door had triple redundancy: electronic locks, mechanical backup locks, and manual override systems. It should have been impossible for prisoners to open their cells from the inside. At 9:34 p.m., Cell 17 opened quietly. Master Sergeant Vega stepped into the corridor, looked left and right, then moved to Cell 23. Somehow, he had an electronic keycard that shouldn't have existed. One by one, he began opening other cells. Not all of them, just specific ones. Inmates who'd been planning something together for months. By 9:47 p.m., 15 maximum security prisoners were loose in Block 7. All of them violent criminals, all of them with nothing left to lose, all of them carrying improvised weapons fashioned from toothbrushes, bed springs, and smuggled materials. This wasn't a spontaneous riot. This was a coordinated escape attempt with inside assistance. Jake was still at his desk when the emergency lighting activated, bathing everything in red shadows. His radio crackled with static. Communications were being jammed. Security cameras flickered and went dark. Surveillance systems had been compromised. Someone had planned this operation very carefully, with detailed knowledge of the facility's weaknesses. That's when Jake heard footsteps in the corridor outside his office. Multiple sets, moving with military precision. These weren't panicked prisoners running for freedom. These were soldiers executing a mission. "Sergeant Thornton," called a voice he recognized. Staff Sergeant Vega, the gun runner. "We need to have a conversation." Jake stood slowly, hands visible. No sudden movements. Through the reinforced glass window of his office, he could see all 15 escaped prisoners arranged in a tactical formation. They'd blocked both ends of the corridor, established overlapping fields of fire with their improvised weapons, and positioned themselves to control every angle of approach. "Professional setup," Jake observed quietly, speaking for the first time in what felt like hours. "We learned from the best," Vega replied. "Some of us, anyway. Before we made our mistakes and ended up in here." Jake opened his office door and stepped into the corridor. The prisoners parted slightly, maintaining their perimeter but giving him room to move. This wasn't standard prisoner behavior. This was military courtesy, the kind of respect soldiers showed to senior non-commissioned officers. "So, what's this about, Staff Sergeant?" Jake asked, using Vega's former rank deliberately. "Information," Captain Morrison answered, stepping forward. "See, we've been doing some research on you, Sergeant Thornton. 16 years you've been working this block, and nobody knows dick about your background. That made us curious." "Curiosity killed the cat," Jake replied mildly. "Maybe. But satisfaction brought it back." Morrison pulled out a folded piece of paper. "You know what this is?" "Printout from a restricted military database. Took us 3 months and some very expensive outside contacts to get it. Want to know what it says about Staff Sergeant Jake Thornton? Jake waited. Nothing, Morrison continued. Absolutely fucking nothing. Oh, there's a service record, but it's 90% redacted. The only things we could confirm: you enlisted in 2001, served multiple combat deployments in classified units, received numerous awards that are themselves classified, and officially died in Iraq in 2008. The corridor became dead silent. Except, Sergeant Kellner added, you're standing right here in front of us, very much alive, working as a prison guard under what we're pretty sure is a completely fabricated identity. Jake's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Something that made 15 hardened criminals suddenly remember they were locked in a concrete box with a man whose true capabilities were completely unknown. Here's what we think happened, Morrison continued, his voice less confident now. You were Black Ops. Deep cover, specialized operations, the kind of shit that doesn't exist on paper. Something went wrong on a mission. Maybe you got burned, maybe your cover got blown. Maybe you just knew too much to stay operational. So your handlers faked your death, gave you a new identity, and stashed you someplace safe until they needed you again. That's an interesting theory, Jake said quietly. It's not a theory, Vega interjected. It's a fact. Because one of our outside contacts recognized you from a photograph. Not your face, that's been surgically altered. But the way you move, the way you hold yourself, certain behavioral patterns that are impossible to change completely. Now here's where everything starts to unravel. Your contact has a name? Jake asked. Morrison hesitated. Former CIA operative. Did contract work in Iraq and Afghanistan. Goes by Blackwater now, but that's not his real name either. Point is, he knows the community. And he says you're Vincent Cross. Jake's stillness became absolute. Not the casual relaxation of someone who wasn't threatened, but the perfect motionlessness of a predator deciding whether to strike. Vincent Cross died in Fallujah, he said finally. Vincent Cross was the most effective interrogation specialist the U.S. military ever produced, Morrison shot back. Got information out of people that nobody else could touch. Not through torture, not through violence, but through pure psychological manipulation. Guy could get inside anyone's head and make them want to tell him their deepest secrets. And then he got too good at his job, Vega added. Started asking uncomfortable questions about who was giving him targets and why. Started wondering if some of the intelligence he was extracting was being used for purposes that weren't exactly patriotic. Started becoming a liability to people who preferred their operations stayed buried. Jake looked around the corridor, taking in positions, calculating angles, assessing threats. Not like a prison guard evaluating a disturbance, but like a soldier planning an engagement. So what do you want from me? He asked. Proof, Morrison replied. We want you to admit who you really are. Because if you're Vincent Cross, then you're probably the only person in this facility who understands exactly how we ended up here. And if I'm not, then you're just a prison guard who's about to have a very bad night. But here's what none of them expected. Jake walked to the center of the corridor, hands still visible, movements slow and deliberate. The prisoners maintained their positions but tensed up, weapons ready, expecting him to either submit or fight. Instead, he spoke in a voice they'd never heard before. Not the mild, patient tone of Sergeant Thornton, the prison guard, but something else entirely. Something cold and precise and absolutely confident. Staff Sergeant Vega, Ramadi Province, Iraq, 2006. You were selling ammunition to insurgents through a contact named Abu Hassan. I interrogated Hassan for 6 hours and got him to give up your entire network, including transaction records, delivery schedules, and offshore banking information. Vega's weapon dropped slightly. Captain Morrison. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, 2007. You were providing convoy routes to Taliban forces in exchange for opium smuggling routes. Your contact was a tribal elder named Mahmoud al-Rashid. I spent 3 days with al-Rashid, and by the end he was begging to tell me everything he knew about American officers on his payroll. Morrison's face had gone pale. Sergeant Kellner, Mosul, Iraq, 2005. You executed 3 civilians during a house-to-house search, then tried to cover it up by claiming they were insurgents. The only witness was a 10-year-old boy named Ahmed. I interviewed Ahmed for 40 minutes, got him to trust me, got him to tell me exactly what he'd seen. Jake paused, looking at each of them in turn. I didn't just build the cases that convicted you. I built the psychological profiles that predicted exactly how you'd behave in prison, who you'd associate with, what kind of escape attempts you'd make, and when you'd make them. The prisoners were backing away now, weapons lowered, the fight going out of them as they realized what they were facing. 16 years ago, Vincent Cross officially died because he'd learned too much about which American officers were betraying their troops for money. Your names were in those files, gentlemen. Every single one of you, along with dozens of others who are either dead, in prison, or still walking free because the evidence against them was too classified to use in court. Don't miss this crucial detail. But here's what you didn't know, Jake continued, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the corridor. Vincent Cross didn't die because he was asking uncomfortable questions. He died because he'd found answers. And those answers were so dangerous to so many powerful people that the only solution was to make him disappear completely. What kind of answers? Morrison whispered. The kind that prove your crimes weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic program to destabilize American military operations in the Middle East. A program run by people who were profiting from extended conflicts, from the chaos, from the need for private military contractors and intelligence services. Jake began walking toward them, and despite being outnumbered 15-1, despite facing improvised weapons and desperate men with nothing to lose, the prisoners continued backing away. You were all patsies, he said. Recruited, encouraged, enabled by people who needed scapegoats when things got too hot. You thought you were getting rich, but you were really just collecting evidence against yourselves while the real criminals stayed safely in Washington counting their profits. That's impossible, Vega stammered. Is it? How did you think you got those contacts in the first place? How did you think you knew which convoys to hit, which bases had weak security, which operations were worth targeting? You thought you were so smart, so connected, so careful, but you were being managed from day one. The truth was hitting them like physical blows. Everything they'd believed about their crimes, about their capture, about their trials, all of it had been orchestrated. The evidence I collected against you wasn't just used to convict you, Jake continued. It was used to protect the people who'd been manipulating you. Every detail about your operations, every contact you gave up under interrogation, every method you used to avoid detection, all of that information was fed back into the system to make the next group of patsies more efficient. Now here's the part that will absolutely shock you. You want to know why I'm here, working as a prison guard? Jake asked. Because 16 years ago, I discovered that my interrogation reports weren't just being used to prosecute traitors. They were being used to train more traitors. The psychological profiles I developed, the manipulation techniques I perfected, the methods I used to break enemy agents, all of it was being reverse engineered to recruit and control American soldiers. The corridor was silent, except for the hum of ventilation systems. I was good at my job. Too good. I could get anyone to tell me anything. But when I started asking questions about how my intelligence was being used, I discovered that some of my targets weren't really enemy agents at all. They were American assets who'd learned too much, who'd started asking the same questions I was asking. Morrison was shaking his head. No, that's not... They wouldn't. Wouldn't they, Captain? You sold troop movements that got 12 soldiers killed. But who gave you access to those movement orders in the first place? Who suggested which insurgent groups might be interested in that information? Who provided the encrypted communication methods you used to contact them? The realization was hitting them all simultaneously. Their crimes, their convictions, their presence in this facility. None of it had been as independent as they'd believed. Vincent Cross died because he was about to expose a network that went all the way to the Pentagon. But the people running that network had one advantage. They knew everything about Vincent Cross. They knew his methods, his psychological makeup, his operational patterns. They knew exactly how to manipulate him. Jake stopped directly in front of Morrison, close enough to touch him, completely unafraid of the improvised weapon in the captain's hands. So they gave him a target he couldn't resist. A captured Iraqi intelligence officer who supposedly had information about American traitors. They let Vincent work on this target for weeks, extracting incredible detail about corruption in the military, confirming everything he'd suspected. And then they killed them both in a staged explosion. Problem solved. The interrogator who knew too much was dead, and all his evidence died with him. Except... Jake smiled for the first time since the conversation began. Except Vincent Cross was paranoid enough to keep backup copies of everything, and smart enough to arrange his own extraction before the bomb went off. But you haven't seen the most incredible part yet. At exactly 10:47 p.m., the lights in Block 7 returned to normal operation. Radio communications crackled back to life, security cameras began recording again, and 15 maximum security prisoners found themselves standing in a corridor, weapons dropped, facing a man they now understood was far more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined. So what happens now? Vega asked quietly. Now you go back to your cells, Jake replied. You serve out your sentences like the soldiers you used to be. You stop planning escape attempts, stop trying to contact outside networks, stop believing that you're victims of an unjust system. And in return, I continue being Jake Thornton, quiet prison guard who keeps Block 7 running smoothly. And Vincent Cross stays officially dead, which is better for everyone involved. Morrison gestured toward the other prisoners. What about them? What about the others who are still out there, still being manipulated? That's not your concern anymore, Captain. Your war is over. You lost. But you're still alive, which means you still have choices to make about who you want to be for the rest of your life. One by one, the prisoners began moving back toward their cells. Not because they were forced to, not because guards were coming with weapons, but because they'd finally understood the true nature of their situation. They weren't political prisoners or victims of conspiracy. They were soldiers who'd been outmaneuvered by better soldiers, and the man who'd outmaneuvered them was offering them a chance to serve out their time with dignity. As Cell 17 closed behind Staff Sergeant Vega, he called out, "Thornton! Cross, whoever you are, thank you." For what? For not killing us when you could have. For giving us the truth, instead of letting us keep believing comfortable lies. For treating us like soldiers instead of animals. Jake nodded once. Everyone deserves to know why they lost, Staff Sergeant. Even traitors. Here's what happened next that will blow your mind. October 24th, 2024. Wednesday, 6 a.m. Jake clocked in for his regular shift exactly on time, just as he had for 16 years. But when he reached Block 7, he found something unprecedented. Every single prisoner was standing at attention in their cells. Not the sloppy, mocking attention they sometimes affected when inspections came through, but perfect military bearing. Heels together, shoulders back, eyes forward, hands at their sides. 52 of the most dangerous military criminals in America, showing respect to a man they now understood was something far beyond their experience. "As you were," Jake said quietly, and they relaxed. But the atmosphere in Block 7 had changed permanently. For the first time in years, it felt like a military facility instead of a zoo. At 7:30 a.m., during routine morning count, Jake noticed that several improvised weapons had been left outside cell doors. Not hidden, not smuggled, but voluntarily surrendered. Sharpened plastic, metal strips, glass fragments, all the tools that prisoners used to feel powerful in a powerless situation. By 10 a.m., the contraband pile had grown to include cell phones, drugs, and other prohibited items that prisoners had been hoarding for months. A complete voluntary amnesty, with no coercion, no searches, no threats. Staff Sergeant Lisa Chen approached Jake during the shift change. "What the hell happened in here last night?" "It's like someone cast a spell over the entire block." "Just had some conversations," Jake replied. "Cleared up some misunderstandings." "Conversations?" "Jake, these guys are acting like reformed choir boys. Morrison asked me to get him some books on military history. Kellner wants to enroll in correspondence courses. Vega requested a meeting with the chaplain. What did you say to them?" Jake finished his paperwork, gathered his personal items. "I told them the truth, Lisa. Sometimes that's all people need." But here's the secret Jake didn't share. That evening, in the privacy of his small apartment off base, Jake opened a secure laptop that hadn't been activated in 16 years. The encrypted files he'd saved as insurance against his own fake death were still there, still intact, still capable of destroying careers and exposing networks that stretched from Baghdad to the Pentagon. For 16 years, he'd resisted the temptation to use that information. Vincent Cross was dead, and Jake Thornton had found peace in routine, in helping broken men serve their time with dignity, in being useful without being dangerous. But last night's confrontation had changed something. Those 15 prisoners weren't the only ones who'd been manipulated. They weren't the only ones who deserved to know the truth about why their lives had been destroyed. Jake began typing, accessing secure communication networks he'd thought he'd never use again. Not to Vincent Cross's old contacts, most of them were probably compromised or dead, but to new networks, younger operators, people who were asking the same questions he'd asked 16 years ago. The war he'd been fighting wasn't over. It had just gone underground, evolved, adapted to new realities. But the basic equation remained the same. Powerful people were using soldiers as disposable assets, and someone needed to protect those soldiers from their own commanders. Vincent Cross might be officially dead, but his mission was very much alive. And this is where the story takes an incredible turn. October 25th, 2024, Thursday, 2 a.m. Jake's secure phone rang for the first time in 16 years. A number he didn't recognize, a voice he did. "Cross." "I prefer Thornton these days." "I know what you prefer." "This is Colonel Sarah Martinez, Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to meet." "I'm retired, Colonel. Have been for a long time. Retirement's over. 3 of our best undercover operatives went dark in Syria last week. Before they disappeared, they sent a single coded message. Network compromised. Cross-protocol activated. Jake was silent for a long moment. Cross-protocol was something he'd developed years ago. A fail-safe system for agents who discovered they'd been burned by their own handlers. Only a handful of people had ever known about it, and most of them were supposed to be dead. How did active DIA agents know about cross-protocol? Because the network you discovered 16 years ago wasn't dismantled when you disappeared. It evolved, got smarter, went deeper. Those 3 agents were tracking the current iteration when they vanished. And you think I can find them? I think you're the only person alive who understands the psychological profile of the people we're hunting. They've been studying your old case files, learning from your techniques, adapting to counter-conventional interrogation methods. But they've never faced the original. Jake walked to his window, looked out at the quiet Kansas landscape. Somewhere out there, 3 American operatives were probably being tortured by people who used his own methods against them. People who'd learned from his successes and his mistakes. What's the timeline? 48 hours. After that, we have to assume they're either dead or completely compromised. And if I help? Then Vincent Cross gets to finish the job he started 16 years ago. Completely. Permanently. With full authorization and unlimited resources. And if I refuse? Then Jake Thornton continues his quiet life as a prison guard, and 3 good agents die because the man who could have saved them chose peace over duty. The choice was obvious, but not easy. 16 years of healing, of finding purpose in service instead of violence, of helping men find redemption instead of breaking them. All of it ending with a return to the shadows he'd fought so hard to escape. Extraction point? Louisville International, private terminal, 0600 hours. Small team, deep cover, maximum deniability. If this goes wrong, you were never involved. And if it goes right, Vincent Cross gets to disappear again. Deeper this time. No more Jake Thornton identity. No more government connections. No more chance of discovery. Complete freedom. But here's the twist that changes everything. October 26th, 2024. Friday, 5 a.m. Jake's final shift at the United States Disciplinary Barracks began like every other day for 16 years. 5:45 a.m. arrival, routine paperwork, morning count. But when he reached Block 7, he found all 52 prisoners standing at attention again. Not because they were ordered to, because they wanted to. "Heard through the grapevine you might be leaving us, Sergeant," Captain Morrison said, when Jake stopped at his cell. "Where did you hear that?" "Walls have ears in a place like this." "Question is, are you going back to being Vincent Cross?" Jake considered lying, maintaining his cover for a few more hours. But these men had earned honesty, even if it was dangerous. For a while. Long enough to finish something that should have been finished 16 years ago. Morrison nodded slowly. Those agents in Syria. The ones who got burned by the same network that burned us. You know about that? We know about a lot of things, Sergeant. Being in prison doesn't mean being cut off from the world. Some of us still have contacts, still hear things, still care about soldiers who are getting screwed by their own people. Sergeant Kellner stepped up to his cell door. "For what it's worth, Cross, we've got your back. Whatever information you need, whatever contacts might be useful, Whatever support we can provide from in here, it's yours. Why would you help me? Because you showed us who we really were, instead of letting us keep pretending we were victims, Staff Sergeant Vega answered. Because you treated us like soldiers, even after we'd betrayed everything soldiers are supposed to stand for. Because you gave us the chance to be better men, even in here. Jake looked down the corridor at 52 of the most dangerous military criminals in America, all of whom were now offering to help him on a mission they'd never officially know about. There might be some risk involved. If this goes wrong, anyone who helped could face additional charges. Sergeant, Morrison said with the first genuine smile Jake had seen from him in years. We're already serving life sentences. What are they going to do? Make us serve double life? And this is the moment that will stay with you long after the story ends. As Jake prepared to leave Block 7 for the final time, Staff Sergeant Vega called out, "Cross!" Vincent, whatever name you're using these days, when this is over, when you've saved those agents and taken down that network, remember something. What's that, Staff Sergeant? You're not just Vincent Cross, the interrogator who broke enemy agents. You're not just Jake Thornton, the prison guard who kept us safe. You're the man who showed 52 broken soldiers that redemption is possible, that honor can be reclaimed, that serving your country doesn't end just because you made mistakes. Jake nodded once, turned to go, then stopped. Staff Sergeant, when I'm gone, I want you to take charge of Block 7. Unofficially. Keep the men focused. Keep them working towards something better than just serving time. Can you do that? Vega straightened to attention. Yes, sir. It would be an honor, sir. Captain Morrison, I want you to start a military history study group. Help these men remember what they used to fight for, what they used to believe in. Sergeant Kellner, you're in charge of physical training. Get everyone back in shape, restore some pride in themselves. One by one, he gave each of the senior prisoners a mission, a purpose, a reason to lead instead of just existing. By the time he was finished, he'd essentially recreated a military command structure within the prison, with the inmates themselves as the leadership. Why are you doing this? Morrison asked. Because someone once told me that the measure of a leader isn't how many enemies he defeats, but how many soldiers he creates. I'm creating soldiers, gentlemen. Soldiers who will serve their time with honor, who will find redemption in service to each other, who will remember that being American means something more than just geography. At 6 a.m., Jake clocked out of the United States disciplinary barracks for the final time. As he walked through the main gate, he could hear something he'd never heard before in 16 years. 52 voices raised in unison, reciting the soldiers' creed. Not because they were ordered to, because they chose to. But what happened in that Syrian compound over the next 72 hours, how Vincent Cross infiltrated a network that had been hunting him for 16 years, how he rescued 3 captured agents using psychological techniques that had been developed specifically to counter his own methods. That's a story for another day. Because some operations remain classified, some victories are never celebrated, and some heroes prefer to work in the shadows, unknown and unrecognized, until the moment they're needed most. But this much can be said. 3 American agents came home. A network of traitors was finally exposed and dismantled, and Vincent Cross disappeared one final time, deeper than before, to a place where he could finally find the peace that Jake Thornton had discovered among broken men in a Kansas prison. and in Block 7 of the United States Disciplinary Barracks, 52 prisoners continued their transformation from criminals to soldiers, led by men who'd learned that redemption is earned through service, that honor can be reclaimed through sacrifice, and that sometimes the greatest victory is choosing to be better than you were.